Many Americans view the colonial period with the Mayflower, the settlers, and the Pilgrims as some of the most boring part of our history. In fact, I have heard some people say that it is one of the most boring founding stories in the history of the world. Well, the more that I learn about it, I have come to see what a miracle it is that this country exists and that those colonies survived. You wouldn't believe just how much. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey friends, welcome to Timeless, the show where I talk about timeless, eternal subjects. If you want to watch the news or learn about the news, you can check out my show, Julie Noted, or I guess it's not a separate show. It's sort of a counterpart or separate segment to this show, but you can watch it on the playlist on this YouTube channel. But welcome. I am wearing a rather conservative dress today that is covering me because we are talking about the colonial period, and I want to channel my inner colonial woman. Just kidding. Actually, if you saw the back of this dress, it's really cute. It's an open back, but you wouldn't know that, obviously. So the reason why I'm talking about the colonial period today is because, like so many of my subjects, I was influenced by a recent book that I read. This book is called A History of the American People by Paul Johnson. He is a British author that recently died. And I bought the book because although I know a lot of parts of sort of later, specifically 20th century American history, I didn't know much about the colonial period. And as I was starting this job where I'm talking about the United States and politics, I thought that it would be incumbent upon me, it would be my responsibility to learn about the parts of our nation's history that I didn't know particularly well. So I ordered Paul Johnson's book and I said to myself, Julie, you're going to read 100 pages on the colonial period. It's going to be really boring, but you just got to get through it to be an informed citizen and an informed commentator. And I tell you, I swear to God, this was riveting. I loved this section so much so that I started watching documentaries and reading other books about the colonial period. And I went from thinking that it was so tedious to absolutely miraculous that our country exists and these colonies survived. I was actually in Washington State, sort of by the border of Canada up north, giving a speech to the Republican Party's annual auction there. And one of the questions, we did a Q&A after my speech, and one of the questions that someone asked me was, what is one part of American history that everyone in the United States should know about? And I said the colonial period, because the more people learn about it, the more, again, you get a sense of how grateful we should be that we survived and this country exists. And I'm going to outline some historical examples of why it is truly a miracle that our country is here now. So as a little bit of background, just like a 2-sentence synopsis, the colonial period and the settling/founding, if you will, of our country occurred way back at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century when the Puritans, who were a religious sect of individuals who lived in Britain, seeking to get away from religious persecution in Europe and by the Anglican or British Church, got on some boats, came over to North America and settled British colonies there. And then, of course, at the end of the 1700s, the colonists there declared independence. We had the Revolutionary War and America was created. Again, 2 sentences in case you weren't paying attention in your 5th grade history class. But there are certain things, in fact, certain developments leading up to the colonial period that were actually really harmful for Western civilization that made America possible. If those harmful, bad events to Western civilization didn't occur, then America wouldn't exist. And I am fascinated by this idea because I think it's sort of true of life. In our everyday lives, sometimes the hardest, most unfortunate, difficult things that happen to us end up facilitating the greatest good or transformation or the most beautiful parts of our lives. So one example is that the Crusades created America. The Crusades, as some of you may know from watching my Islam 101 or Islam 101 Part 2 episodes, was when certain Muslim populations, after the founding of Islam in the 7th century, came and conquered parts of Europe. And then the Crusades were when the Christians tried to reconquer the parts of Europe that the Muslims had conquered. So again, in the 7th century, Muhammad, who is the prophet of Islam, founded Islam. And from there, literally within 100 years, Islam had gone beyond Saudi Arabia and went into the Persian Empire and went into what is now Israel and Palestine and Syria and Lebanon and parts of Europe. And there was this Muslim takeover of the formerly Christian parts of Europe. In 1453, the Muslims came, certain Muslim tribes came and conquered the Byzantine Empire, which was formerly the Roman Empire. So this was a time in history where Christendom was failing. Christendom was being replaced. And the Crusades were an attempt, and a lot of the Crusades actually failed, of the Christians to reconquer Europe. So when Christians were failing to reconquer Europe, they ended up succeeding, but during this time they were sort of failing, they decided to look elsewhere. And instead of reconquering the lands that they had lost in Europe, they decided to get on some boats and colonize the Americas, land, many miles and an ocean away from the lands that they once had jurisdiction over. And so it is, again, so fascinating that the Christian sort of failure or displacement in Europe created the Christian success in the Americas. And had that failure not taken place, then the Americas wouldn't have existed. So what happened was, starting in the 1300s, or actually, starting in the 1400s, various kingdoms in Western Europe started to unify as a Christian entity and began to bring Christianity elsewhere. The Portuguese started to settle on islands on the West African coast, specifically Cape Verde. The Spanish wanted to compete with Portugal, so they sent Christopher Columbus, who famously, of course, in 1492 landed in the Bahamas. He thought that it was East Asia, but it was in fact the Americas. And then from there, the British jumped on board, and in the end of the 1500s, they sent their colonists to colonize what we now know as the East Coast of the United States, North Carolina, Virginia, all of those former colonies. Another example of how a huge challenge and indeed failure for Western civilization facilitated America, another example of that is the French Revolution. So America was founded in 1776. We won the war in 1781. And then, just a few years after America was established as a country, the French underwent a revolution that tore down the monarchy, at least temporarily, and created a lot of upheaval. That was in 1789. That was literally less than a decade after America was founded. And as weird as it sounds, as paradoxical as it sounds, the fact that the French had a revolution helped America hugely, because the French, who were also trying to colonize North America, every power was trying to colonize North America, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, etc. The French were kept busy because their own country was experiencing a revolution. And also the British were kept busy because they looked over at this revolution going on in France, and they obviously, and also having just gone through the American Revolution, they got really afraid. And so the British actually, when they lost the American Revolution in 1781, wanted to reconquer America. But the fact that the French immediately after had a revolution scared them and made them not go back to reconquer America. So the French Revolution was sort of a distraction and a buffer for us, the United States, to continue to grow without further onslaught and foreign interference. And the War of 1812, again, another boring thing that people think of, the War of 1812 was basically the British's last attempt to retake America. But that was 20 to 30 years after America was founded. And it's great that we had that buffer period of 30 years to sort of get our stuff together, build a nation, build a militia to defeat the British in 1812. And the thing that enabled us to have that buffer period was the French Revolution, which was harmful for Western civilization, but really helpful for America. Just so interesting the way, again, these bad events facilitated a really good event, i.e. our success. Another example of how a bad event facilitated a good event with regard to the colonial period and the founding of America is that actually the first American colony failed. We think of the first American colony as the settling of Jamestown in 1607, or the settling on Plymouth Rock when the Mayflower sailed in 1620. No, actually, the first American, or I guess British, colony was in 1585 in Roanoke, which is a coastal town on what is now, I believe, North Carolina. British settlers went on a boat in 1584, came over into Carolina, settled in 1585 in Roanoke, and they left their children there. And this is amazing. No one knows the story. They left their children there. They went on a boat to go back to England to gather supplies and tell everyone that they had, made it to this land and colonized it. They went back to England. They got their supplies. They spread the word. They came back to Roanoke, and all of the people that they had left there had died because they were kidnapped or killed by the Native American tribes that were there. And Paul Johnson says that as horrible as it is actually sort of a blessing in disguise for the future of America that this first colony failed. Again, although people got slaughtered, it was awful. In the long-term scope of history, Paul Johnson argues that it was a blessing. A, because the Spanish were sort of nearby and would have tried to suppress it had the Native Americans not suppressed it. B, crucially, because this was a secular colony. This, unlike Jamestown and Plymouth, this was not rooted in sort of a religious inspiring to bring a new country and a new fulfillment of God's will to America. A lot of the reason why America succeeded is because our first settlers and colonists were religious, and they really did believe that setting up a republican government was a fulfillment of the will of God. This first settlement in 1585 in Roanoke, it was secular. The people there did not have the same sort of religious conviction, and that's another reason why it failed. And then also another reason why Paul Johnson argues that it was sort of a blessing that this failed is that Roanoke was too reliant on supplies from England. That's why the people got on the boat, went back to England to get supplies, and when they came back, everyone there had been kidnapped or killed. The later colonists that came to Jamestown and to Plymouth looked at this Roanoke colony, saw its mistakes, and learned from them, which enabled the subsequent colonies to succeed. Indeed, actually, what we know as the first colonies, or what I'm referring to now as the subsequent colonies, i.e. Jamestown and Plymouth, those almost failed too. Another example of how miraculous it is that America succeeded. In 1620, when the colonists made landfall, who were on the Mayflower, and they came to Plymouth Rock, there were 102 British settlers on the Mayflower. That's not a lot. And by the way, it's also incredible. They signed something called the Mayflower Compact on the Mayflower, where they basically agreed to follow rules and establish a republican government. Just the amount of restraint and principle that they had is really just astounding, and I admire it hugely. 102 people were on the Mayflower, made it to Plymouth, and half died the first winter. There were only 51 people left after that first winter in the colony up there in Plymouth. Ready for this? This gives me the chills. By 1750, the 13 colonies had 1 million people in their population. So literally in 130 years, the American colonies went from having 52 colonists to having 1 million. There are states today in our union, such as Wyoming, such as Montana, such as Delaware, that haven't hit the 1 million mark as far as their population. And in 130 years, the American colonies did that. It's I don't know. I don't know if you don't find that to be amazing. I don't know what to tell you. Ben Franklin wrote that the country that he was in, which of course then was the colonies, but he saw it become a country, had doubled in population since his childhood, and it would actually double again throughout his lifetime. And finally, another miraculous thing that I want to leave you with, this first sort of part was about the failures that sort of contributed to success, or the challenges posed to Western civilization that made this civilization possible. This next one is about sort of the character and principle of the colonists. It's amazing that really from the start of the colonies, they were amazingly democratic. And I want to pause and just make it clear, for those of you who are sitting and thinking that I am providing a sort of glamorized version of history, I recognize that there were some really savage, awful things that happened with the founding. Of course, the displacement of the Native American population. Of course, the fact that starting in 1619, the first slaves came to the Americas. That is all something that we should know about and we should not ignore. And I know this history was not perfect. But I think also we get so caught up in all of these horrible things that we don't remember and have any appreciation for the amazing democratic initiatives that sprung out immediately. And the fact that people did this in the 1600s, when it was, I mean, literally the entire world was just empires and kingdoms. There was no United States of America for someone to look to as an example. These people built it on their own. It's amazing, given this time, given this culture, that these colonists had, as I said earlier, enough restraint and enough principle and enough fortitude to build a system that we are the beneficiaries of today. From the start, the colonies were amazingly religiously diverse. In fact, the different states, the different colonies were founded to embody or to sort of host different sects of Christianity. So of course, Massachusetts was Puritan. We know about the Salem witch trials and how, certain members of the population were persecuted. By the way, one interesting thing about the Salem witch trials, another really sort of unique thing about America, it was confined to the summer of 1692. It was awful. It was irrational. People got killed. It was terrible. But it was confined to that one summer. And once it was over, the people who were in charge of persecuting and killing the so-called witches, they were thrown in jail and they were revoked of their magisterial titles. And also the victims' families were paid reparations. That is an amazing thing that happened after the Salem witch trials in 1692. But anyway, Massachusetts was Puritan. And then there was this guy, Roger Williams, who was an antinomian, which basically means he wasn't Puritan. He wanted to sort of be his own sect. He went up to what is now Rhode Island, founded Rhode Island as its own sort of religiously pluralistic haven. That's why the capital is called Providence. He thought it was God's providence for him to be there. The state of Maryland was founded by Catholics, hence Maryland, so that they could go away from the Puritans and sort of have their own area. Pennsylvania famously was Quaker. And it's just amazing that these people during this time went and settled different lands, and each land was sort of its own hub of the religious sect that the people wanted. And in the 1700s, Thomas Jefferson issued this Religious Toleration Act, which essentially he said, it doesn't matter to me what religion people practice, we just have to be tolerant of one another. Again, doesn't mean that there wasn't some forms of persecution, but that diversity is incredible. And also, there were written constitutions and lower elected assemblies in each of the colonies immediately. Connecticut was one of the first. In 1639, it had its first constitution, not only in America, but in the world, when it established the fundamental orders of Connecticut. Again, we have to understand there was no counterpart. There was no example of the United States of America for people to draw on. Of course, the colonists drew from the Magna Carta, which was written in the early 13th century, which is sort of the British Bill of Rights. They had certain democratic documents to draw on, but they came from an empire ruled by a monarchy, and they set up these new institutions here. Another example, of course, they were slaves, and that was savage and horrible, but we had indentured servants here in the United States, and unlike indentured servants in other parts of the world, the indentured servants that came to America had to serve 5 to 7 years, whatever their term was of servitude. And then when they were done with that 5 to 7 years, they were free citizens who could own land and vote. That is another moral invention of the time, that those people, once they served their sentence, were free. By our standards today, it doesn't seem very impressive, but for the standards back then, it certainly was. So just to zoom out a bit, I think we should all have such an appreciation and a sense of what a miracle it is that all these people got on a boat, left everything they knew, came here with an amazing amount of principle, braved the Atlantic Ocean to come to a land that they didn't know and settle and create this Republican government amid all of the turmoil and challenges. That is not a boring story. That is amazing. Thanks so much for being here today. I hope that you enjoyed it, and feel free to email me if you have any questions or any subjects you want me to cover at julie@julie-hartman.com. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. Take care. See you soon.